Splatoon 3's Side Order DLC is great, albeit it has some glaring issues. And I will be treating this pretty well as a new game, especially since I don't think I've covered Splatoon 3 on the channel. Anyway, let's get into it and talk about gameplay. And while I was worried when I found out it was going to be a roguelike, I don't mind nearly as much as I was expecting, and it isn't even because I dislike roguelikes, it's just because one of my favorite parts of Splatoon, in fact, my favorite part, is Octo Expansion. Its tightly crafted, well-designed, challenging, and fun levels are great, and honestly, that's what I want to see more of from all of Splatoon. All three games have an incredible base campaign, and this itself is great, but I want to see more like Octo Expansion. And frankly, this ended up coming pretty close. But as for gameplay, it's a standard roguelike in terms of its formula and gameplay loop. Climb the 30 floors of the spire, fight a boss along the way, and slowly get more items to make your run more powerful. And it's really fun. Most of the levels are enjoyable, albeit I found a lot of the turf zone levels, especially when they have multiple zones, really annoying. So, let's talk about level types, starting with the one I mentioned, which doesn't have an image on the Splatoon wiki yet. But yeah, the zone protection levels. They're like the same mode in ranked, and god, they are not fun. They are repetitive, boring, basically force you to stay in one spot, and it's way too easy to get overwhelmed by enemies, especially if you don't have a good build or weapon for clearing hordes of them. Not to mention, I've seen stages that are either ridiculously easy as they put you at the top of a high pillar where you just need to guard one exit, or at the very bottom of a cavern, which makes it almost impossible to secure all the sides. I could relatively comfortably say I think the majority of my deaths have come from this level type. And I think it says something that unless the reward for clearing it is really good and exactly what I want for my build, I'll almost always ignore this type of level as I do not enjoy them. And it gets even worse, because later levels and higher difficulties add multiple zones you need to protect at once. And some of them are really hard to traverse between. Genuinely, even just a single grind rail in between the 2 points would help out on several of these maps. Next up are the portal levels. And these are pretty fun. There are a set number of portals that spawn enemies. Your goal, destroy them. Once you destroy them, they'll explode in a glorious splat of ink. And these levels are also good because there's a multitude of ways you can approach them. You can try to slowly chip away at the orb while dealing with the enemies it spawns, or what I do, rush in and hit the orb. It will probably kill everything else anyway when you blow it up. It's quite good, and since the game uses the same floor layouts that are slightly altered for each challenge type, which I should probably mention, it's also good because I find this level type works on basically every single floor layout. Overall, I quite enjoy the portal levels. But let's move on to the next section, that being the fish levels. And these levels will either be a cakewalk or a wild goose chase, just kinda depending on the build and level layout. Since if you have something like the Mist Cloud Bomb, it's super easy to trap them and prevent them from escaping. Or certain upgrades that make it so your enemies travel slower in your own ink. But if you don't have that or movement speed, it can be really annoying to corner them. But this is another one that the level variation works really well for. I've seen levels where you start with a Beyblade and you just get to knock it into them, or ones where you chase them into a bomb. It's really fun. But sadly, that's really all I have to say about this level type. The hardest it can get is if you're getting swarmed by enemies, or if other enemies happen to look very similar to your target. But anyway, let's move on to the next level, Turbine. These remind me most of the tower defense levels in the main game. Basically, you spew a turbine with your ink, and it moves along a path, You have to hit it with extra ink at checkpoints, and once it reaches the end, the level is cleared. But to add a little extra spice, once it clears the checkpoint, it releases a heap of ink that knocks back enemies. Just like the portals, both allowing for the player to be calm and collected and go at their own pace, or if they want to go blazing guns ready, you can. It's up to you to do the situation as you see fit and make sure you can handle the number of enemies that are coming at you. But that's about all I have to say for this level type, so on to the 8-ball. The 8-ball levels, you sink the 8-ball into a hole to get a point. Do that for every 8-ball and you win. Also,
the sun is a deadly laser.
And the big guys with 4 heads have a special behavior where they're going to try to knock it away from the goal. Personally, I like using the 8-ball as a weapon to murder everything in my path. And that covers it for level types. Just kidding. But before the discussion about the bosses, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps with the channel an absolute ton, and I appreciate it every little bit. But yeah, there are the bosses. And for the most part, they are quite good. The first boss in the game, you only get to fight once unless you redo the initial climb, which is entirely scripted, and it's quite fun. It also serves an important purpose that I will get to later. Additionally, there are bosses against a bunch of Inklings, as well as a ball and a tower. Generally, quite fun and fair bosses. If your build revolves around spawning ads, don't worry, they're still going to spawn a ton. But if it doesn't, you can still focus purely on their own DPS. But where this is actually about is the final boss! If you do not want spoilers, but want to hear me talk about things like the music and story, to a less of a spoilery degree, please go to the timestamp on screen. Anyway, I'm not even going to bother calling this thing by the real name, so I'm just going to call it Order. Order is stupid. And remember who I mentioned a little bit against the first Marie boss fight? I actually really like that. It teaches you how to fight this. And that is great. It tells you how to weaken it early on. If you can remember. Might take you a while to get here. And that was the... Really? That's the only positive? This fight is stupid and unfair. Genuinely. I hate it. It swarms you with so many enemies. Which wouldn't be that bad. And it really isn't in the first 2 phases. Until you reach the 3rd phase, where it gets the Stingray attack. Which forces you to only focus on dodging. Not dealing with the constant ads that spawn. Not dealing with the actual thing you're supposed to do to deal damage. Just moving. And if you get hit once, you're gonna get hit again and die. Because unless you so heavily buff your speed, you cannot escape the attack with the reduced speed of your armor being broken. And even if you manage to get lucky and it breaks your armor and then the attack stops, the 30 seconds of constant enemy spawning that you've had to ignore are going to swarm you, and you are going to die. I don't have an issue with difficult fights. I don't have an issue with difficult games. The Dark Souls games are a great example of that. The only difference is they're fair. In this boss fight, almost every single death I've had, and I have had a lot, almost always felt horrible. It felt like it wasn't my fault, and frankly, it felt cheap. Compare that to something like Dark Souls or Elden Ring, where almost every single death I had across those entire games almost always felt like it was my fault. And it hurts even more in this case, because since it's a roguelike, oh, you lost all your lives? Better start from scratch! And again, I would not have an issue if the deaths felt fair. If it felt like I deserved to die, if it felt like I messed up. But what am I supposed to do when I can't focus on dealing with the enemies that are swarming me if I have to focus on dodging? Genuinely, this fight had a cool idea. And generally, I think it succeeded. If you remove or reduce the enemy spawning, or increase invincibility frames on the Stingray, or make it so it will not hit you again for a while. Albeit the second half of the fight, once you get past phase 3, while it's completely free, is a cool spectacle. And hello everyone who skipped ahead because they didn't want to see spoilers. Welcome back. Now we get to talk about the music. And generally, I think it's really great. It's the distinct Splatoon vibe, but it also has a lot more mechanical and techie elements, which make it stand out. But since a lot of those techie elements sound factory-esque, it also simulates order in a way that music somehow is capable of doing. With the few songs that aren't for the main levels being from Off the Hook, that basically are an anthem breaking free of this order and embracing chaos. Look, I'm no musician, but I think it's really cool how music can invoke those feelings into somebody, even if they don't really understand why or how. The point being, I think it does a great job. It's still distinctly Splatoon, while it stands out and fits the new environment this game takes place in. And I'm gonna keep this brief, but the story. It is a direct follow-up to Octo Expansion, and you once again play as Agent 8, which is great. Despite me not liking Pearl and Marina at first, Octo Expansion made me fall in love with them. And this expansion continues to show why they have become my favorite of the newscasters. No, seriously, I was like super suspicious of especially Marina at first. And frankly, just was not willing to give up the Squid Sisters. Ignore the fact they just consistently keep falling down and down the ranking. The story of the campaign itself is fine enough. But just like most of the Splatoon, if you decide to look into the side stuff and the nooks and crannies, it's quite good. But I also appreciate that, because if you don't care about the story, it's entirely optional. The fact is, most of it's in collectible form. But that's a good thing, since if you're someone like me who enjoys the story of the Splatoon world, you can still have it. But if you don't care for it, then it's easily ignorable. Before I end this off, I have heard some people being worried that the game won't be too replayable due to the lack of floor variation. And honestly, I agree with that 110%. I have seen so many duplicate floors already, and I still have so much to do. I have less than half the palettes unlocked. But frankly, getting bored of a roguelike comes pretty natural to me. I have hundreds of hours in Isaac. I have dozens of hours in other roguelikes. And I usually play them for a bit, get bored of them, and then a couple months later, I come back to them and fall right in love with them again. And the same thing will probably happen with Side Order. So, what are your thoughts? I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!